Okay, so let's talk about critical discourse analysis, or CDA. Um, Here's a little overview of what we're going to talk about. We'll start by contrasting notions of manipulation of language with cooperation. So, Grice and Neo Griceans talk about how interlocutors cooperate together according to certain maxims. Here, the focus of critical discourse analysis and other particular ways of viewing language look at the notion of manipulation, how certain groups, certain individuals manipulate language in terms of power. Um, and what CDA, critical discourse analysis, is based upon is the notion of the way that language encodes, expresses, reflects a particular ideology, a way of looking at the world, and how that way of looking at the world, that ideology, is in the thrall of the maintenance of the power relationships that exist in society. I'm going to illustrate CDA in various contexts. We'll look at racial discourse. We'll look at gender. We'll look at food, the environment. We'll look at the political manipulation of metaphor. And then we'll look at media and national identity. And then finally, we'll look at some of the limitations of CDA. Okay, so the notion of manipulation, of course, is nothing new in terms of how language works. What we can do is contrast CDA with other kinds of focuses upon how language is used to manipulate particular responses. So we can go as far back as the ancient Greeks and their theories of oratory, captured in the term forensics. Forensics are referred to the way that we can use particular rhetorical techniques to persuade our audience of our particular point of view. Similarly, in literature, the more recent way of looking at the linguistic elements of literature and how they create particular effects is captured by the particular methodological approach of stylistics. Advertising, of course, uses language very much for persuasion. And if we look at talk exchanges, professional talk between doctors, patients, in a courtroom, between professors and students, we're looking at a field which has been dominated by the interactional sociolinguistics. And again, we're looking at the way that particular relationships, often power relationships, are maintained through the use of language. When we get to CDA, their main focus is on the media and politics, and how the media reflects certain views of the world which reflect particularly the status quo and the maintenance of certain power relationships. Okay, so the real grandfather of critical discourse analysis is Norman Fairclough, and his seminal book Language and Power. So, critical discourse analysis examines how discourse reproduces and maintains stereotypical ways of perceiving the world in terms of sexism, racism, ageism, nationalism, etc. In addition to linguistic theory, the approach draws very heavily upon social theories, and especially the contributions of Marx, Gramsci, and neo-Marxists, Althusser, Habermas, Foucault, and Bourdieu. What these particular neo-Marxist views of society try to capture is the notions of power, of oppression, of state apparatus, in terms of the way that a state controls the way people think through certain control of media, etc. And they use terms like the masses. Um, Perhaps we can begin to see that in terms of the ideology of CDA, it very much is expressed through a lot of these particular words. Um, so let's look a little more closely at the notions of ideology and power. So ideology is kind of a big word. If we talk about it in terms of a particular view of the world or worldview, it tends to soften it a little bit. But this is the term that's used, and it's used to connect with notions of power in society. So, discourse reveals speakers' ideology or view of the world. The ideology implicit in a discourse influences the hearer's or reader's view of the world. So we have the notion now of the way that discourse can manipulate the particular reader or hearer. Discourse can be a way of both exerting and reflecting the power relationships in society. And it should be said that a lot of the use of ideology, the expression of ideology, is unconscious. That is, we tend to repeat the ongoing stereotypical ways that we see the world when we're not really conscious of actually endorsing a particular ideology. One of the originators of CDA was a particular research group in Glasgow called the Glasgow University Media Group, and they did a series of books which analyzed the media, especially in the with respect to a political event at the time in Britain, which was the miners' strike, which was a huge conflict between the miners' union and the Tory government, which Thatcher, the leader of the Conservative Party at the time, actually won. It was a rather drawn out and contentious conflict, and so this particular media group was interested in how established newspapers reported this conflict and how they revealed certain ideological views, both in favor and against the two parties in the conflict. Okay, so I'm going to try and illustrate how CDA would work in various contexts. And this first context is a historical marker. It's a historical marker that's found in a square in Savanna. The historical marker is actually dated 1952, but it's still there now in 2017. So in a sense, the discourse of that marker is still prevalent. It still affects people who stand in this square. The square is a monument to one of the chiefs of the Native Americans who first helped create Savanna. This is Tomochichi, his particular grave. And on this particular historical marker, if we move down to the part that begins with Mary Musgrove. Mary Musgrove, half-breed niece of Emperor Grim of Creek Indians, acted as interpreter between Oglethorpe and Tomochichi. So Oglethorpe was the English man who came and settled Savannah, started the silk trade there. So this is a monument to the Native American Tomochichi. But what is kind of screaming out of this historical marker is this particular ideology of miscegenation, of the notion of being half-bred, which I think most people today reading this marker would reject that as a very racist way of depicting somebody's birth. Here's another example, and this comes from Alden Library. In Alden Library, there's a remarkable collection by the photographer Edward Curtis, and he took photographs at the beginning of the 20th century of Native Americans. And there's a whole book of his photographs, and each of the photographs is accompanied by a caption. And here's the caption that accompanies this particular picture of Moza, a Mojave girl. It would be difficult, and this is Curtis is speaking here in 1903. It would be difficult to conceive of a more aboriginal than this Mojave girl. Her eyes are those of the fawn of the forest, questioning the strange things of civilization, on which it gazes for the first time. No doubt Curtis was very sympathetic to the situation of the Native Americans, but here is a particular view of Native Americans as somehow not connected to civilization. Civilization is something that he, the white man, is bringing. So we have a whole ideology here of racial superiority, racial dominance that's reflected in this particular caption. It's interesting to imagine what this girl is actually thinking to herself as she's posing for Curtis's photography. I imagine her saying some pretty kind of bad stuff as she has to patiently wait there for the guy to take his photograph. Another example, and this is a little dialogue that I've actually made up, but it's based upon true situations. A white policeman stops a black man in the South, I presume, although no doubt it could happen anywhere in the United States. And he says, "What's your name?" "Dr. Poussin." "No, what's your first name, boy?" Okay, so that address to a boy is reflective of a particular ideology which asks for a particular relationship between a white man and a black man. And it's, again, it's a racial put down, it's expressive of racial dominance of whites over blacks. The term man was actually introduced by jazz musicians to counter the particular demeaning use of the word boy. So in these kinds of relationships, we get the expression of particular ideologies through the choice of language. Ideology can be expressed in far more unintentional ways. And this is an interesting series of research that was done by Billings and Eastman about sports coverage and sports commentary, and how sports commentary contain particular biases with regard to gender and ethnicity. So this particular paper looks at our TV sports announcer talk in terms of the coverage, the NBC's coverage of the Summer Olympics in 2000. What they found was that, let me just back up and say that the research question was that did NBC's coverage of the 2000 Olympics show bias towards any gender, ethnicity, or nationality? And this included something like 54 hours of TV commentary. So this is what they found. When sports announcers talked about black athletes, they described their success in terms of innate athletic skill and courage, whereas white athletes' success was usually characterized by their superior commitment, composure, concentration, and experience. So black athletes are born with their athletic skills. White athletes develop their athletic skills through their commitment, composure, and concentration. White athletes, by the way, were mentioned, a lot more than black athletes. In terms of gender, women athletes were viewed as having less athletic skill and less commitment to their sports than were men athletes. And comments about attractiveness for women were far more than for men. Comments about strength were twice as frequent in regards to men than women. And there was a bias in terms of the coverage of male athletic events as opposed to female. The interesting thing here is that sports commentary is kind of innocuous, and it's not the case that the sports announcers intentionally wish to depict the athletes in particular ways. What they're doing is unconsciously passing on the stereotypical views that they have received, we've all received, and then we repeat them and reinforce them. So these are kind of stereotypical views that are hidden in the way everyday discourse that we are involved in on this kind of innocuous level of sports commentary, but it does have an effect. It does convey an ideology, a way of viewing the world. You might see that in some of these particular presuppositions that often occur. I've just made these up But women are just as intelligent as men. Well, why wouldn't they be as intelligent? Why wouldn't they be more intelligent than men? She's beautiful. She's a beautiful blonde, but exceptionally intelligent. Okay, that's a kind of a joke, isn't it? But it still com- conveys the idea that looks don't necessarily go with intelligence. Well, maybe they do, and they can do. Um, she had as many as five other men in her life. Shock, horror. If it's a man we substitute there, we might think, so what? When you get married, you'll have to pick up after yourself. I've often said things like that to my children, but notice it conveys a particular stereotypical view that you will get married, right? Well, maybe they won't. And here, a favorite one, usually coming from the mouth of a male parent at a sports event, a school sports event, especially when it's a co-ed game. I've heard this shouted many times: "Don't let a girl beat you." Well, what's wrong with a girl beating you if that girl is superior in terms of skill? And if I said to you, I took my cat to the vet, you probably would say, what did he say was wrong? That is, we tend to stereotypically reach for a male gender to describe the particular vet. So those are all the little ways in which particular uh, ideologies are part of our everyday interactions. Um, you can see it also in terms of a very innocuous situation of the examples used in syntax books. This is a study by Macaulay and Bryce. And what they did was they collected a series of syntax books which have made up sentences to illustrate particular grammatical structures. And what they found um, uh, was that if you look at the bottom there, at the statistics at the bottom, that in the third person female, right, appeared as the subject in 8% of the example sentences, whereas males occurred as the subject in 49%. Okay, so it's the males who are represented as the subjects. It's they that are more often represented as the agents, and the female as the patients, rather than the subjects or agents. And that's just the, again, unconsciously, it arrives in a particular book, syntax book, mainly written by males, unconsciously reflecting a particular view of the world, that males are more subjects and agents of the world, and females are more passive patients of the world. But it reinforces, even though it's unintentional, it really reinforces these very big stereotypes. Um, where it gets more important, in a sense, or where it becomes consciously used, is in terms of particular conflicts. This is based on a study of Susan Ehrlich's study of rape hearings in judiciaries and universities. And what Ehrlich is trying to get at is the way that we can use language to remove agents. So if you take a transitive sentence like Romeo kissed Juliet, we can transform that into an agentless passive. Juliet was kissed, or even worse, she was raped. And what Ehrlich found in her book representing rape was that there's various strategies that male defendants used to deflect their agency in the situation of a charge of rape. So often males would use a consensual form. We started kissing. They're more likely to use agentless passives. All our clothes were taken off, which you think of as kind of absurd. Um, Unaccusative constructions, the sexual activity started escalating, as if this was something not under the control of any one person. And then the use of nominalizations. Her shirt came off first as a result of fondling. Fondling? Not because of someone's particular actions. So this is the way that language can be used to deflect from and conceal the particular roles that people play in terms of actions. Um, let's move on to another context here, and this seems pretty innocuous. Um, uh, and this is the area of food. And let's look at the notion of vegetarianism. And this is a quote I took from a very famous book in favor of vegetarianism, Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. And so the quote in this book, which kind of stood out to me, was on average, Americans eat the equivalent of 21,000 animals in a lifetime. Well, it took me a kind of a while, and I still found it difficult to conceive of one human eating 21,000 animals in a year. Okay? Think about it. What kind of animals come into your mind? Okay? If you're like me, you probably thought of things like chickens, or probably cows, maybe turkeys, probably fish. Okay. When I looked a little closer at this particular quote, I looked at where it came from, and it was from a person called No More, and it's supposed to be a calculation based on a calculation of USDA statistics. So what I did is I found the web page where that particular quote came from, and here it is. Yeah, sure, people eat chickens and turkeys and pigs and cows, but keep going down, and this 21,000 animals is made up of 17,000 shellfish. Now, I presume that when you thought about animals prototypically, you didn't think of shellfish, you didn't think of clams or shrimp or whatever. Okay. Um, so in a sense, it's a manipulation. It's a trick. It's a trick to say something that shocks us, but then when we look a little deeper, we find that it's really not as true as we thought it was true, in the sense that our prototypical animal, being a chicken, has been replaced by something like a shellfish, right? Which, you can eat several shellfish in one meal. By the way, by 2011, that same web page was reporting that the number of animals had gone down to 16,000, and it also came with a kind of another particular shocking statement. In 2011, the average American meat eater was responsible for the deaths of, and here we have the listing. Okay. So in 1 year, that means 134 shellfish, right? But what's interesting here is the use of the phrase "was responsible for the deaths of." It's what we call negative semantic prosody. It's particular phrases that are used and always have a negative association. So if you do a little bit of Googling, for example, you get some examples like these. Tony Ben admired Chairman Mao, responsible for the deaths of millions. The communist leaders of the USSR were responsible for no fewer than 15 million deaths. Bin Laden relative could be held responsible for the deaths of thousands. Monsanto's Roundup may be responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of farmers around the world. Abu Mazen, responsible for the deaths of thousands of Syrians. So clearly, if you're a meat eater and you're in good company, or I shouldn't say good company, you're in pretty awful company, you're responsible for the deaths of all these animals in the same way that Chairman Mao was responsible, Stalin was responsible, Bin Laden's relative, etc., etc. We could take that to a kind of an absurd level if we wanted. And so here's the blue whale, and the blue whale main food is krill, which are tiny little creatures. They just open their mouths, and thousands of krill go into their gullet and into their stomach, and that is the way they feed. So by one estimate, a blue whale eats an awful lot of krill in 1 year. So we could come up with this shocking statement that a blue whale is responsible for the deaths of I can't even say, is it 14,600,000,000 animals in 1 year? That's a lot of animals, right? So, I mean, who'd have thought it? That worse than Chairman Mao, worse than Stalin as mass murderers is the blue whale, which, has got a good press for a long time, the way we've thought about whales. But look at that, responsible for all those deaths. So, this is the way that we can manipulate language to convey particular, to support certain beliefs. Now, I'm not arguing against vegetarianism. Vegetarian is fine, but like everything, if we use language to promote and distort the particular positions, then that is something that we have to be careful about. Here's one other example of manipulation of language, and in terms of the larger environment, not just food. And this is a particular movement to putting the capital back in nature. So the way that we usually spell nature these days is with a lowercase n. Historically, though, it has been spelt with an uppercase n, which reflected a particular viewpoint about certain elements that received the uppercase n. So the word nature, and this is taken from Earth Values webpage. So nature here is given the uppercase n. The word nature was first used in the 12th century. It has come to represent in its many definitions all of the universe and living and non-living things within it. Before the scientific revolution, nature, uppercase n, was considered in a spiritual context, deserving of respect and admiration, just as we've come to use nature's capital, animals, different meaning of capital, animals, fresh water, minerals, forests, in a non-sustainable way. We have replaced the capital letter N in nature with a lowercase one. A coincidence? Perhaps. So, again, just through the use of punctuation, we can promote a particular view of the world, i.e., a view of nature as being a particular force which not only has physical qualities but has spiritual qualities as well. Okay, so moving on to some last couple of areas here. We're going to look at politics in sport and the use of metaphor. And this is a particular paper, very fascinating paper by Semino and Maschi. Politics is Football, Metaphor in the Discourse of Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. So Silvio Berlusconi has been, and still alive, a controversial Italian politician who has actually been the prime minister of Italy on several occasions, 1994 to 95, 2001 to 2006, and 2008 to 2011. He's also one of the richest people in Italy. He owns 3 TV channels and was the former owner of AC Milan, the football team. And in 1994, when he went into politics, he founded a political party called Forza Italia. The actual choice of the phrase Forza Italia is following the usual slogans that are used to describe soccer teams, right? So Forza Roma, come on Roma. Forza Italia, come on Italy. So he made a conscious attempt to describe his party in the same terms that fans describe and talk about their team. So this is what Lakoff and Johnson say in their particular seminal book about metaphor. We have found that metaphor is pervasive in everyday life, not just in language, but in thought and action. Our ordinary conceptual system in terms of which we both think and act is fundamentally metaphorical in nature. So metaphor is pervasive, and here we have the manipulation of metaphor from one domain into another particular target area. So Lakoff and Johnson distinguish target and source domains. Metaphor allows us to talk about and think about one area of experience, the abstract, um, um, in the that which is called the target domain, in terms of another which is concrete. Okay. Which is the source domain or vehicle domain. So if we want to talk about the abstract idea of argument, we can talk about it in terms of the uh, 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 concrete source domain of war. So we take metaphors from war and apply it to the target domain, which is argument. So she attacked every weak point. Your arguments are indefensible. He won the debate. So those are all uses of metaphor that reflect the source domain of war. So this is what Berlusconi did when he created Forza Italia. Um, Notice how he not only used things like Forza Italia, derived from Forza Roma, come on, whatever team, but he also chose the color blue, Azzurro, which reflected the national team. And he also had uh, uh, posters that reflected his team of politicians in the formation of a soccer team. Um, and so it's perhaps in Italy, the national soccer team is the clearest symbol of national unity, because Italy is a very young country as a whole. It's only been known as Italy for about 150 years. And it really is very regional, as you can see from that map. So something that unifies the whole of the country is often something like sports. So what Berlusconi was doing was trying to tap into that notion of sport and identity and a national symbol by transferring all the metaphors from football to his political party. And so we get some examples of this. Berlusconi's decision to enter politics was in terms of scendere in campo, which means to walk onto the pitch. Okay. Um, and when he talked about building a right-wing coalition, he talked about una squadra vincente, a winning team that would engage in a partita, a match with the team of the left. Um, here's an extended piece from his discourse where he explains the reason why he decided to enter politics. Così ho sentito che la partita si faceva pericolosa, che era tutta giocata nell'area di rigore e che il centrocampo era desolatamente vuoto. E ci siamo detti che non potevamo lasciare quell'immenso spazio libero. So the bolded phrases there are all phrases taken from soccer. So I felt that the match was becoming dangerous, that it was all being played in the penalty areas, and that the midfield was sadly empty. And we said to one another that we could not leave that space free. Okay, so again, he's using the source domain of soccer to use that metaphor in a political sense. And so when Berlusconi was talking about his government, he compared it with AC Milan, which he used to be the chairman of at the time. I hope I will give the country a good government, most of all, a good team. For the moment, I am celebrating Milan winning the league championship. The Italians should follow the example set by my players. So again, he's trying to make the comparison between his government and a soccer team. And you can see that as we mentioned, in his the way he presented his materials in terms of elections. The party symbol is an Italian flag against a blue background, and that black background, of course, is the same color as the national team's uniforms. And he had big meetings with people waving flags, very similar to a crowd at a soccer match. Okay, so that was one example in that paper an illustration of how language in terms of metaphor can be used to promote a particular political viewpoint. In the next series of pieces of research, looked at the role of media in national identity. Okay, um, so the media form part of a nation's recorded history and act as a conduit for concepts of national identity. These are powerful heritage-laden collective notions offering shared points of reference that help to bind individuals into a national community. Um, and this particular work looks at cultural stereotypes. Here's an interesting stereotypical view expressed by the manager at the time, the coach at the time of Manchester United, a man called Alex Ferguson, who was knighted for his service. And United were playing Bayern Munich. And there was an incident in the game in which one of the United players was sent off. He got a red card. So this is Ferguson speaking. There is no doubt about it, Ferguson told ITV when asked if the dismissal had changed the course of the game. They were never getting through that tie. With 11 men, we had no problem. The young boy showed a bit of inexperience, but they got him sent off. Everyone sprinted towards the referee. Typical Germans. What does that mean, typical Germans? It's very interesting because most of the players who were playing for Bayern Munich were not German. They were Dutch. In that picture, you can see one Dutch player, two Dutch players, and one French player. Frank Ribéry is French. So most of the team is not made up of Germans, but players from all over Europe. So what is it to be typical German? Well, it feeds into a whole set of stereotypes that the British have about the Germans. And you can begin to guess that this is all part of the historical relationships between Britain and Germany and two world wars, etc., etc. This is something that's looked at in a book called Football and European Identity, which is a very fascinating way of looking at European identity. It actually looks at the discourse in several different newspapers in Europe and looks at how they characterize themselves and how they characterize other countries. So the English identity expressed in the English media is always in terms of fair play and the notion of the bulldog spirit. Okay, so the English media talks about sportsmanship, the Corinthian spirit, which is a reference to the beginnings of soccer in the public schools, which were actually private, and how people played not to be professionals, but played just for amateurism's sake. And those were the kinds of values that were captured in the Victorian notions of amateur sport. Contrasted that with the British view of the Europeans, who are actually called continentals, or they were in the past, less so now. And the continental players are always feigning fouls, flopping or diving, feigning injury, and doing things like that. So that's the way that the English view the foreigners, and it's a notion of the stiff upper lip. So here's a report. It's kind of old, but it's still very much the prevalent view that the English media has in terms of British national identity with respect to the rest of Europe. So this is goes back to 1964, and it's a report of a game. England also had a couple of goals disallowed for offside. Hunt at the quarter hour, Burn 5 minutes from time. Each decision was taken calmly and sportingly, underlying the difference in attitude and temperament. Right? So it's the English who are the sporting ones. Of course, those Brazilians are temperamental. Okay, so this is something that goes through this whole particular study. And I'm you can just look at some of the ways that they describe the English, right? The bulldog spirit, the lions, the lion heart. They stress collective effort versus individual skill. So the English teams are always hardworking, gallant, fighting, lots of heart. They have courage, resilience, stamina, etc. As opposed to the other teams, which only rely upon skill. um, and so this one particular paper by Bishop and Jaworski looks at the coverage of England versus Germany. And of course, here what it taps into is a whole history, a whole set of stereotypes derived from the particular wars that these countries have fought. And you can begin to see it in some of the, I'm just flipping through some things here. Okay, so here's a reference to the Battle of Waterloo, which is a famous battle where Napoleon was defeated by the Duke of Wellington. So again, it's going back into history, looking at particular identities and latching onto those identities and presenting particular stereotype views of the world. And here's a nice one now. It's war. The way to lift a nation. Tenacious England finally escaped the German grip with classic bulldog spirit. Okay? And if you read that, you get to the last sentence. The German side may not be one of the greats, but the arrogance was as strong as ever. So stereotypical way of viewing Germans in sport is in terms of arrogance, according to the English media. Okay, so we understand now that CDA is an attempt to make transparent the particular ideologies that underlie, consciously or otherwise, the use of discourse. And we've looked at many different contexts in which we can begin to look at ideology. So let's look at some of the weaknesses of CDI. Well, the first one is that it tends to be, in contrast to a lot of other linguistic approaches to discourse, rather unscientific. And it tends to have insufficient linguistic data. So we don't know, and it's not clear, how the critical discourse analyst knows that what they believe is to be the subsect is the same as what the addressee derives. So, for example, there may be a subtext, but is that what the particular addressee derives from the communication? We don't understand in many ways the effect, if there is an effect, of particular worldviews, ideologies. There is a tendency to think in terms of language use as in terms of conspiracy. It's rather conspiratorial. I'm sorry about what happened to the L there. A view of how language is used. As we've made the point here, a lot of the way that ideology is transmitted is unconsciously. It's a repetition, a repeating of other kinds of schemas, ways of viewing the world, which are just entrenched in language and culture. There's a certain political agenda that we can begin to see at work with CDA. It aims to look especially at the roots of social disparity and see how they're reflected through language use. So there is a notion that society is unequal, and there's an attempt to be able to try and look at these particular sources of oppression. Notice the words that are used: oppression, the masses, state apparatus, which do very consciously reflect a particular political agenda. And there tends to be a feeling of an inflated sense of its own importance. Okay, clearly ideology is an important part of discourse, but it's not the only part. It's not the only thing that's going on. And so reducing a discussion of discourse to power and ideology may misrepresent in many ways what's happening with that particular language.